NYC neighborhoods. There's a neighborhood in New York City where you can walk one block and hear Mandarin, then Korean, then Spanish, then English, in that exact order. A place where the food alone could take you 6 months to fully explore, and most tourists have never even heard of it. Another neighborhood was literally reborn twice, once as a cultural revolution, once as a real estate feeding frenzy, and the people who started the revolution ended up being priced out by their own success. And then there's Harlem, a place that was Dutch farmland, then a Jewish enclave, then the cultural capital of Black America, and is now in the middle of a transformation so complicated that residents and historians can't even agree on whether it's progress or loss. 3 neighborhoods, 3 completely different stories, but they all answer the same question, the one nobody really asks about New York City. Who actually gets to stay? Let's get into it. Most people think Harlem has always been what it became in the 1920s, but that's not even close to the truth. The neighborhood was originally a Dutch settlement established in 1658 and named after a city in the Netherlands. By the late 1800s, it was a largely white, middle-class suburb of Manhattan, home to Jewish and Italian-American families who'd made it out of the Lower East Side. Then, a real estate bubble popped. Developers had overbuilt, the subway extension got delayed, and suddenly there were empty apartments everywhere. A Black real estate agent named Philip Payton Jr. saw the opening and negotiated with desperate landlords to move Black families in. One by one, the blocks turned. By 1920, Harlem was transforming. By 1930, the census showed that over 70% of Central Harlem's residents were Black. And the density was extraordinary. The neighborhood was running at over 215,000 people per square mile in the 1920s. That's 3 times the population density of all of Manhattan today. What grew out of that density was one of the most extraordinary cultural explosions in American history, the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. The argument these artists were making, through poetry, music, theater, and visual art, was that Black Americans were intellectual, artistic, and fully human at a time when the country was actively trying to prove otherwise. Then the Depression hit. By the early 1930s, 25% of Harlem's residents were out of work. The neighborhood that had been a beacon became a trap. Property owners stopped maintaining buildings, the city stopped investing, and for the next 40 years, Harlem was systematically neglected by banks that redlined it, by politicians who ignored it, and by a city that had already moved on. Here's where it gets complicated, because what came next wasn't just a recovery, it was something far more contested. By the 1980s, 60% of the housing in Central Harlem was city-owned, taken over due to unpaid taxes. A quarter of it was flat-out abandoned. Storefronts boarded up, buildings left to rot. People who'd lived there for generations were trapped in a neighborhood the city had essentially written off. Then, 2 things happened. First, a federal program called the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone started pumping cash into the area in 1994. Second, the crime crackdown of the late 90s, whatever you think about the methods, drove down the numbers fast. And suddenly, people with money noticed Harlem's brownstones. Property values in Central Harlem increased nearly 300% during the 1990s. By comparison, the rest of New York City saw a 12% increase over the same period. Empty shells of buildings were selling for close to $1 million each by 2007. The New York Times reported in 2010 that Black residents had ceased to be a majority of Greater Harlem, defined as 96th to 155th Street, by 1998. Let that sink in. Within just a few years of investment finally arriving, the community that had built Harlem's identity began to be pushed out of it. The restaurant story alone tells you everything. Harlem was once packed with soul food institutions, places where the recipes had roots in the South, where the cooking carried generations of memory. Slowly, they started closing. Not because the food got worse. Soul food is still thriving in Queens and Atlanta. They closed because the rent went up, and the people who'd eaten there their whole lives couldn't afford to live nearby anymore. Real estate developers even tried rebranding the area between 110 and 125th Street as Soha, South Harlem, in the style of Soho to accelerate the premium pricing. Longtime residents called it insulting. Multiple city politicians moved to legally block the practice. So when someone asks whether Harlem's transformation is a success story, it depends entirely on who you're asking. And that's not a simple question. Now, shift gears. Cross the East River and land in Brooklyn, circa 1990. Williamsburg was not cool, not even a little bit. It was a post-industrial stretch of warehouses, Hasidic enclaves, Puerto Rican and Dominican families, and a few remaining factory workers. Rents were cheap because nobody wanted to be there. The waterfront smelled. The subway connection to Manhattan was one unreliable L train, which is exactly why artists started moving in. By 1996, an estimated 3,000 artists were living in Williamsburg. They took over warehouses for studios, converted lofts for performances, painted murals on brick walls, and started something called the Brooklyn Immersionist movement. Artists and musicians making work in streets, on rooftops, in spaces that had no permits and no business model. It wasn't a scene trying to be discovered, it was a community trying to survive. What happened next is a story that plays out in cities everywhere, but rarely this fast. The indie rock explosion of the early 2000s put Williamsburg on the map. The neighborhood became synonymous with a particular kind of creative energy, raw, weird, uncommercialized. Bands like Vampire Weekend played their first self-organized shows at Glasslands Gallery. Labels like Daptone Records, home to Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, were operating out of South Williamsburg. The music press couldn't stop writing about it. Then, the Bloomberg administration rezoned the Williamsburg waterfront in 2005, shifting large swaths from industrial to residential, and the floodgates opened. Luxury high-rises went up along the East River almost overnight. The Gretsch Guitar Factory, one of the neighborhood's landmarks, was converted into Tribeca-style lofts. Whole Foods moved in, then the chain stores, then the condos. The final blow was almost poetic in its cruelty. Vice Media, a company that had built its entire brand on underground anti-establishment culture, purchased the building that housed Death by Audio and Glasslands Gallery in 2014. Both venues, two of the last organic cultural spaces in Williamsburg, were evicted to make room for a corporate office. The artists who'd made Williamsburg desirable scattered to Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, Red Hook, and eventually further out into Brooklyn and Queens. The neighborhood they'd built was now too expensive for them to live in. And then, a strange thing happened. Williamsburg didn't die, it transformed again. A new nightlife scene emerged, a contemporary art market arrived. Young professionals paid $3,500 a month to live somewhere that 30 years ago nobody wanted. The creative energy didn't disappear, it just changed owners. Here's a fact that might genuinely surprise you. The largest Chinatown in New York City is not in Manhattan. It hasn't been for years. It's in Flushing, Queens, and it has surpassed Manhattan's Chinatown in both size and population. Some people have started calling it the Chinese Times Square. Others call it the Chinese Manhattan. And the story of how it got there is one of the most fascinating quiet migrations in American urban history. In the 1970s, Flushing was a predominantly white neighborhood with a small Japanese community. Then, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which had finally ended decades of restrictive immigration quotas, started reshaping who could come to America. Taiwanese immigrants began arriving in Flushing. They were largely Mandarin-speaking, often educated, and found Manhattan's original Cantonese-speaking Chinatown culturally unfamiliar. Flushing had space. Flushing had affordable rent. Flushing became Little Taipei. By 1986, roughly 60,000 Chinese residents were living in Flushing alone, and the community kept diversifying. Fujianese immigrants, Wenjianese, people from Shandong, Sichuan, and Dongbei. Each wave brought its own regional cuisine, its own dialects, and its own businesses. Today, you can eat Hunanese hot pot, Xinjiang lamb skewers, Shanghainese soup dumplings, Taiwanese beef noodle soup, and Mongolian food, all within a few blocks of Main Street and Roosevelt Avenue. The intersection of Main Street, Casina Boulevard, and 41st Avenue has been called one of the busiest pedestrian intersections in the world. The World Journal, one of the largest Chinese-language newspapers outside China, has offices here.